The house was quiet. Too quiet. Claire sat in the corner of the living room, her knees pulled up to her chest as she stared at the empty chair across from her. It was James's chair, always slightly reclined, with the faint indentation of his body still visible in the worn leather. He had spent countless evenings there reading, watching television, or simply talking to her while she worked on her sketches. Now it was just a hollow reminder of the life they had shared, of the man who had filled her days with laughter and her nights with warmth. Her hands clutched a steaming mug of tea, though she didn't drink it. The tea had gone cold, just as the house had. The once bright walls, adorned with photos of their adventures and memories, seemed duller now, shadows of the joy they had once held. Claire's gaze lingered on one of the frames, a picture of the two of them standing on the edge of a cliff during a hiking trip, the wind in her hair, James's arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. His grin was as wide as the horizon behind him, and she had never felt safer than she did in that moment. She couldn't look at it for more than a few seconds without feeling the ache bloom in her chest, so she turned away, her vision blurring with unshed tears. It had been a year since the accident, but the pain was still raw, sharp as the first day she had learned he was gone. James had been the center of her universe, the steady, grounding presence that made her feel invincible. Without him, the world felt off balance, unfamiliar, as if she were walking through someone else's life. The days blurred together, each one dragging into the next with a suffocating sameness. Mornings were the hardest. She would wake up, reaching instinctively for him, only to find his side of the bed empty. The absence was a void, a cold expanse that no amount of blankets could fill. Some mornings she would sit there for hours, unable to summon the strength to move. The silence pressed down on her like a weight, and the only sounds were the faint creaks of the old house settling and the occasional hum of the refrigerator. Afternoons weren't much better. She would wander aimlessly through the house, picking up objects that once held meaning, a book with his favorite passages underlined, a sweater that still faintly smelled like him, only to set them down again when the memories became too overwhelming. She had stopped going out, stopped answering calls from friends who meant well but didn't understand the depth of her grief. The few times she had ventured to the grocery store or the bank, she had felt like a ghost, moving through the world unseen, untethered. In the evenings, the loneliness was at its peak. She would sit on the couch with the television on, not really watching, just needing the background noise to drown out the thoughts that threatened to consume her. She hadn't touched her sketchbook in months. The sight of it only reminded her of how James used to sit beside her, offering suggestions or playful critiques of her work. His encouragement had always been her motivation, and now that it was gone, the creative spark within her had dimmed to nothing. Claire wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders, as if it could shield her from the memories that crept in unbidden. She remembered the way James used to make her laugh until her stomach hurt, the way he would pull her into a dance in the middle of the kitchen for no reason at all. She remembered the way he smelled after a long day, earthy, warm, familiar, and how his voice could calm her no matter how chaotic the world felt. But most of all, she remembered his touch, the way his hand would linger at the small of her back, or how his fingers would tangle with hers in a way that made her feel like they were the only two people in the world. That touch was what she missed the most. It was the absence of him, the empty space beside her, the silence where his laughter should have been, that made the grief so unbearable. The house was too big, too quiet, too full of memories she wasn't ready to face. The world outside her window moved on without her. She could see neighbors walking their dogs, children riding their bikes, the mailman making his rounds. It all felt so distant, like a movie playing on a screen she couldn't reach. She wondered if she would ever feel part of it again, if she would ever find a way to live without feeling this gaping hole in her chest. Claire's fingers tightened around the mug, her knuckles white. She knew people expected her to move on, but how could she? James wasn't just part of her life, he was part of her. Losing him felt like losing a piece of herself, a piece she wasn't sure she could ever get back. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, Claire let out a shuddering breath. She set the mug down on the coffee table and leaned back into the couch, her eyes drifting closed. The tears came then, silent and steady, rolling down her cheeks as the weight of the day settled over her. She whispered his name, barely audible in the stillness. James. It was the first time she had spoken it aloud in weeks, and the sound of it broke something inside her. The sobs came harder then, her body shaking as she clutched the blanket to her chest. She felt small, fragile, like she might shatter under the force of her grief. But even in her anguish, there was a flicker of something else. A memory, faint but persistent, of James's voice in her ear, his words soft and certain. "You're stronger than you think, Claire. You always have been." She clung to that memory like a lifeline, her tears slowing as the words echoed in her mind. She didn't feel strong. She felt broken, lost, like she was drowning in an ocean she couldn't see the end of. But James had always believed in her, even when she couldn't believe in herself. As the room darkened, Claire made a silent promise to him, to herself. She didn't know how, and she didn't know when, but she would try. Try to find a way forward, to find a reason to get out of bed each day. For now, it was just a whisper of resolve, fragile and uncertain, but it was something. And for the first time in a long time, something felt like enough. The rain came down in relentless sheets, drumming against the roof of the house and streaking the windows with rivulets of water. Claire sat at the kitchen table, the dim light of a single lamp casting a warm glow over the untouched plate of food in front of her. The storm outside mirrored the storm within her, a ceaseless, inescapable torrent of emotions that she couldn't outrun. She stared at the rain-soaked yard, her thoughts a tangled mess of grief and fatigue. She barely noticed the sound at first, a faint whimper almost drowned out by the rain. But then it came again, sharper this time, tugging at her attention. Claire frowned, her brow furrowing as she set down her fork and rose from the table. Moving to the window, she peered out into the darkness, but the rain was too heavy to see anything clearly. The sound came again, a soft, pitiful cry, and her heart tightened instinctively. She grabbed her jacket from the back of a chair and stepped onto the porch, the cold wind biting at her skin. Pulling the jacket tightly around herself, she squinted into the rain. That's when she saw him. Huddled at the edge of the porch was a golden retriever, his coat drenched and matted, his body shivering violently. His soulful brown eyes met hers, wide with a mix of fear and pleading. He was young but not a puppy, his frame lean and athletic, though it was clear he had been wandering for some time. His tail wagged weakly, as if he wanted to show friendliness but lacked the energy. Claire's breath caught. For a moment she hesitated, her mind racing. She wasn't ready for this, wasn't ready for the responsibility of another being depending on her. She could barely take care of herself. But the sight of him, so vulnerable and alone, stirred something deep within her that she couldn't ignore. "Hey there," she said softly, her voice carrying over the sound of the rain. She crouched down, holding out her hand. "It's okay. You're safe." The dog flinched slightly, his body tense as if bracing for rejection. But when she didn't move, didn't push him, he seemed to relax, his ears perking up just a little. Slowly, hesitantly, he took a step closer, his movements cautious but deliberate. Claire's heart ached as she took in the state of him. His fur was soaked through, his paws muddy, and she could see the faint outlines of ribs beneath his coat. "You poor thing," she murmured, her voice breaking slightly. "Where did you come from?" He took another step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. Then, as if deciding to trust her completely, he closed the gap and pressed his cold, wet nose against her hand. The warmth of his touch sent a jolt through her, an unexpected connection that brought tears to her eyes. She hadn't realized how much she had missed this feeling needed, missed the simple act of comforting another soul. "Come on," she said gently, standing and gesturing toward the door. "Let's get you out of the rain." The dog followed her inside, his steps tentative but steady. Once in the warmth of the house, he shook himself vigorously, spraying water everywhere. Claire laughed despite herself, the sound foreign and surprising. It had been so long since she had laughed, since anything had felt light. "Hold on," she said, grabbing a towel from a nearby cabinet. She knelt beside him, rubbing his fur with careful, deliberate movements. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing as if savoring the simple act of kindness. His trust was immediate and unwavering, and it disarmed her in a way she hadn't expected. When she finished drying him, she sat back on her heels, taking him in. His golden coat was soft and slightly wavy, and his face was open and expressive. He looked at her as if she were the center of his world, his tail wagging gently now that he was warm and dry. "You need a name," she said, her voice thoughtful. "How about Sunny?" At the sound of his new name, his ears perked up and his tail wagged more enthusiastically. Claire smiled, a real, genuine smile that felt like the first in forever. "Sunny it is," she said, running her fingers through his fur. "You look like a Sunny." He followed her as she moved through the house, his steps light and careful, as if he didn't want to intrude. When she sat back down at the table, he curled up at her feet, letting out a contented sigh. His presence was grounding, a quiet reminder that she wasn't as alone as she had thought. That night, as the rain continued to fall outside, Sunny stayed by her side. When she finally went to bed, he settled at the foot of the mattress, his body curled into a protective ball. For the first time in months, Claire didn't feel the crushing weight of loneliness pressing down on her. Instead, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't dared to hope for: comfort. Over the next few days, Sunny became a constant presence in her life. He followed her from room to room, his quiet companionship filling the empty spaces in a way that felt effortless. He was playful but gentle, nudging her hand when he wanted attention or lying quietly beside her when he sensed she needed space. His ability to read her emotions was uncanny, almost as if he understood her better than she understood herself. Claire found herself talking to him more and more, sharing little thoughts and memories that she hadn't spoken aloud in months. "James would have loved you," she told him one afternoon as they sat on the porch together, the sunlight streaming through the trees. "He always talked about getting a dog, but we never seemed to have the time." Sonny rested his head on her knee, his warm brown eyes meeting hers with a depth that took her breath away. It was as if he were telling her that it was okay, that James would have approved, that she didn't have to carry the guilt of moving forward. With Sonny by her side, Claire began to venture out more. Their morning walks became a ritual, the crisp air and Sonny's boundless energy pulling her out of her stagnant routine. Neighbors she hadn't spoken to in months stopped to admire him, their friendly smiles and casual conversations slowly drawing her back into the world. For the first time since James's death, Claire felt a flicker of hope. It was fragile, tentative, but it was there. Sonny had come into her life when she needed him most, and though she didn't fully understand it, she couldn't shake the feeling that he had been sent to her for a reason. As she watched him chase a butterfly across the yard one bright morning, his golden coat gleaming in the sunlight, Claire felt a warmth spread through her chest. Sonny wasn't just a dog, he was a symbol of something she hadn't dared to believe in for a long time, the possibility of healing, of joy, of finding a way forward. The first week with Sonny was a blur of tentative steps, quiet moments, and unexpected warmth. Claire hadn't planned on letting a dog into her life, but Sonny seemed to slip through the cracks of her guarded heart with an ease that left her both unsettled and comforted. He had claimed his spot in her home, and, without her realizing it, begun carving out a space in her heart. Each morning began the same way now. Claire would wake to find Sonny stretched out at the foot of her bed, his golden fur catching the morning light. The sight of him so peaceful and present was like a balm. It was a small thing, but it made getting out of bed a little easier, a task that had once felt monumental in the wake of James's death. Their first walk together was awkward. Claire wasn't sure if she was doing it right, fumbling with the leash as Sonny bounced excitedly at her side. He pulled ahead one moment, lagged behind the next, his energy boundless and infectious. At first she was irritated, but then she caught herself laughing, a soft, genuine laugh that surprised her. Sonny glanced back at her, his tongue lolling out in a goofy grin, as if he knew exactly what he was doing. By the second walk, they had found a rhythm. Sonny seemed to sense her pace, slowing when she wanted to linger and quickening when her stride grew purposeful. As they wandered through the quiet streets of her neighborhood, Claire found herself noticing things she hadn't in months: the way the trees swayed gently in the breeze, the faint scent of wildflowers carried on the air, the warmth of the sun on her skin. It was as if Sonny was pulling her back into the world, one step at a time. In the afternoons, they settled into a routine. Sonny would curl up on the rug in the living room while Claire sat by the window with her sketchbook. At first, she only meant to doodle, to see if the act of drawing could stir something within her that had long been dormant. But as her pencil moved across the page, she realized she was sketching Sonny, the curve of his ears, the way his tail wagged when he caught her eye, the light in his expressive gaze. He seemed to sense when she was working on him. He would lift his head, cock it slightly to the side, and watch her with an intensity that made her laugh. "You're a terrible model," she teased one day as he bounded over to nuzzle her hand, smudging the edge of her sketch. But even as she said it, her heart swelled. He was becoming more than a companion, he was her muse, her quiet encouragement to pick up the pieces of herself she had thought were lost forever. Sonny's presence began to weave itself into every part of her day. When the afternoons felt too heavy, when memories of James threatened to pull her under, Sonny would press his warm body against her side, his steady breathing grounding her. When she sat at the kitchen table, lost in thought, he would rest his head on her lap, his soft brown eyes reminding her that she wasn't alone. He didn't demand anything of her, no forced conversations, no empty platitudes. He was simply there, his loyalty and love unwavering. Their bond deepened in ways Claire hadn't expected. Sonny had a knack for drawing her out of herself, for making her engage with the world in small but meaningful ways. One day, as they walked past a neighbor's yard, Sonny stopped abruptly, his tail wagging furiously. A little boy, no older than 6, ran up to the fence, his eyes wide with delight. "Can I pet him?" the boy asked, his voice filled with wonder. Claire hesitated, her instinct to retreat kicking in. But Sonny had already made up his mind, wagging his tail even harder as he pressed against the fence, his nose sniffing eagerly at the boy's outstretched hand. "His name's Sonny," Claire said softly, her voice catching. The boy giggled as he patted Sonny's head, and for a moment Claire felt a warmth she hadn't known in a long time. Interactions like these became more frequent. Sunny had a way of drawing people to him: neighbors, passers-by, even the grumpy mailman who once ignored Claire's greetings but now stopped to give Sunny a quick scratch behind the ears. Each interaction chipped away at the walls Claire had built around herself, reminding her that the world wasn't as lonely as it seemed. But the bond between them wasn't just about the good moments. Sunny was there for the hard days too, the days when grief crept in like a shadow, threatening to consume her. One evening, as she sat on the couch, clutching one of James's old sweaters, the weight of her loss hit her with full force. Tears streamed down her face, her sobs shaking her body as she buried her face in the fabric that still faintly smelled like him. Sunny was at her side in an instant, his head pressing against her knee, his soft whine cutting through her despair. He didn't move until she set the sweater aside and wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his fur. He let her hold him, his warmth seeping into her as her sobs subsided. For the first time, she felt like someone understood, not with words, but with presence, with quiet, unwavering love. It wasn't just Claire who was healing through their bond. Sunny seemed to come alive in her care, his coat growing shinier, his energy brighter. She took him to the vet for a checkup, ensuring he was healthy and happy, and began spoiling him with new toys and treats. Each wag of his tail, each playful bark was a reminder that she was capable of caring for something again, of loving without fear. One evening, as they walked along the edge of a nearby park, the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Sunny trotted ahead, his tail wagging as he chased a butterfly that flitted just out of reach. Claire watched him, a smile tugging at her lips. The sight of him, so carefree and full of life, filled her with a sense of wonder she hadn't felt in years. As they headed home, the thought struck her with surprising clarity: she wasn't just healing because of Sunny, she was healing with him. Their bond was mutual, a partnership built on trust, love, and the quiet understanding that they had both needed each other. That night, as she lay in bed with Sunny curled up at her feet, Claire felt something she hadn't dared to hope for since James's death. It wasn't just the absence of pain, it was the presence of something new, a flicker of joy, a hint of hope. A quiet, unshakable sense that she was no longer walking this journey alone. Sunny had given her that, and in doing so, he had given her back a piece of herself she thought she had lost forever. The idea of the trip came to Claire unexpectedly, as if carried to her on the breeze that wafted through the open kitchen window one afternoon. She was washing dishes, her hands submerged in warm, soapy water, when her gaze drifted to the small postcard pinned to the refrigerator. It was faded now, the colors softened by time, but the image of the rugged coastline and endless blue ocean still stirred something deep inside her. It had been James's dream to visit the place on the postcard, Monarch Bluffs, a remote stretch of coastline known for its dramatic cliffs and untamed beauty. He had talked about it often, weaving vivid pictures of windswept trails and sunsets that painted the water in hues of fire and gold. They'd planned to go one summer, but life, as it often did, had gotten in the way. Work, responsibilities, and the belief that there would always be more time had kept them home. Now, that time was gone. Claire set the dish aside and stared at the postcard. For months, it had been a silent reminder of what they'd lost, of all the things they would never do together. But now, as she stood there with the smell of soap and lemon lingering in the air, she felt something shift. Maybe it was Sunny's steady presence at her side, his golden tail thumping softly against the floor as he watched her with those knowing eyes. Maybe it was the growing sense that she couldn't stay stagnant forever. Whatever it was, she made the decision before she could talk herself out of it. "We're going," she said aloud, the sound of her voice surprising her. Sunny's ears perked up, his head tilting slightly as if to ask, "Going where?" She smiled, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "You'll see," she said. "It's time for an adventure." The morning they left, the air was crisp and clear, the sky a canvas of soft blues and whites. Claire loaded the car with a mix of nervous energy and quiet determination, packing everything she thought they might need: food, water, a blanket for Sunny, and her old camera, which hadn't seen the light of day since James's passing. The camera had been a gift from him, a tool for capturing the beauty he always said she saw so effortlessly. She wasn't sure why she brought it now, but it felt right, like a piece of him coming along for the ride. Sunny jumped into the back seat eagerly, his tail wagging as if he could sense the significance of the journey. Claire adjusted the rearview mirror, her hands gripping the steering wheel for a moment before she exhaled deeply. "Here we go," she murmured, pulling out of the driveway and onto the open road. The first few hours passed in a blur of winding highways and stretches of countryside. Sunny alternated between staring out the window, his nose pressed against the glass, and lying with his head resting on her shoulder whenever she stopped at a red light. His quiet companionship was a balm, soothing her nerves as she ventured further from the familiar safety of her home. As the miles ticked by, Claire found her thoughts drifting to James. The memories came unbidden, a mix of joy and sorrow that swirled together like the colors of the sky outside. She remembered the way he used to sing along badly to the radio on road trips, his voice loud and off-key but filled with such infectious enthusiasm that she couldn't help but join in. She remembered the way he always insisted on stopping at roadside diners, claiming that they held the best food and the best stories. And she remembered the way he would look at her when she laughed, his eyes crinkling at the corners, as if her happiness were the only thing that mattered in the world. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she reached over and ran her fingers through Sonny's fur, grounding herself in the present. "You would have liked him," she said softly, her voice trembling. "He would have loved you." Sonny let out a soft huff, his tail wagging against the seat. It was as if he understood, as if he were telling her it was okay to remember, to feel, to carry James with her in this way. The first stop on their journey was a small lakeside campground. Claire hadn't planned to stop, but the sight of the sparkling water and the clusters of trees that lined the shore had drawn her in. She parked the car and stretched, watching as Sonny bounded out excitedly, his nose to the ground as he sniffed every blade of grass. They spent the afternoon exploring the trails that wound through the forest, the sound of birdsong and rustling leaves filling the air. Claire brought out her camera for the first time, hesitating for a moment before snapping a picture of the sunlight filtering through the trees. The act felt strange, like flexing a long unused muscle, but also comforting. With each click of the shutter, she felt a little closer to herself, to the part of her that James had always encouraged. That evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Claire sat by the lake with Sonny curled up beside her. The water mirrored the colors of the sky, a blend of orange, pink, and lavender that took her breath away. She pulled out her camera again, capturing the scene before turning the lens on Sonny. He looked up at her just as she pressed the button, his golden fur glowing in the light, his eyes filled with the kind of joy that made her heart ache in the best way. "Perfect," she whispered, lowering the camera. Sonny nudged her hand, his warm, solid presence reminding her that she wasn't alone. The closer they got to Monarch Bluffs, the more Claire felt the weight of her grief lifting, replaced by a quiet anticipation. Each day brought new sights, new moments that reminded her of the beauty still left in the world. She began to talk to Sonny more, sharing stories of her life with James, of the dreams they'd had and the plans they never got to fulfill. Sonny listened, his ears perking up at her voice, his tail wagging at all the right moments. One evening, as they sat around a small campfire, Claire pulled out her journal, a habit she'd abandoned in her grief. She opened to a blank page, the empty lines staring back at her, and hesitated. Then, slowly she began to write. The words came haltingly at first, but soon they flowed freely, her thoughts spilling onto the page in a cathartic release. She wrote about James, about the pain of losing him, but also about the joy he had brought to her life. And she wrote about Sonny, about how he had come to her when she needed him most, about how he was teaching her to find light in the darkness. When she finished, she looked down at Sonny, who was lying at her feet, his head resting on his paws. "You're a good listener," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Sonny thumped his tail, his eyes meeting hers with an understanding that went beyond words. When they finally reached Monarch Bluffs, the sight of the cliffs took Claire's breath away. The ocean stretched out before her, endless and wild, the waves crashing against the rocks below in a rhythmic symphony. The wind whipped through her hair, carrying the scent of salt and freedom. For the first time, she understood why James had wanted to come here. It was a place that demanded you feel alive. She stood at the edge of the cliff, Sonny by her side, and pulled out the small vial of James's ashes she had brought with her. She had been unsure if she would be ready to let them go, but now, standing here with the sun setting over the water, she knew it was time. "I love you," she whispered, her voice carried away by the wind. "Always." With trembling hands, she opened the vial and let the ashes scatter into the breeze. The particles blending with the ocean air. Sonny pressed against her leg, his warmth steadying her as tears streamed down her face. As the last rays of sunlight bathed the cliffs in golden light, Claire felt a sense of peace she hadn't thought possible. She looked down at Sonny, his golden coat glowing in the fading light, and smiled. "Thank you," she said softly. "For everything." Sonny wagged his tail, his eyes filled with a quiet joy that matched her own. Together, they turned away from the edge and began the walk back, the sound of the waves fading behind them. It wasn't the end of her journey, but the beginning of something new, a life filled with hope, with love, and with the knowledge that she could carry James with her while still moving forward. Sonny had shown her that, and for that she would be forever grateful. The cliffs of Monarch Bluffs were bathed in the soft hues of twilight, the ocean below glimmering like molten silver under the fading light. Claire stood at the edge of the overlook, her arms wrapped around herself against the cool breeze that swept in from the sea. Behind her, Sunny sat quietly, his golden fur catching the last rays of sunlight. He was still, watching her with an intensity that made her feel as though he understood everything she had been carrying. She had thought reaching this place would bring her peace, a sense of closure she desperately needed. And yet, now that she was here, standing where James had always dreamed of standing, she felt the weight of her grief more acutely than ever. The vial of his ashes was clutched tightly in her hand, its presence both a comfort and a burden. Claire stared out at the horizon, the endless stretch of ocean mirroring the endless ache in her chest. She had carried James with her through every moment of this journey, his voice a whisper in her mind, his laughter an echo that lingered just beyond reach. But now, with the sea calling to her, she realized that letting go wasn't just about him, it was about her. About freeing herself from the cage of grief that had held her captive for so long. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crash of the waves. Sunny let out a soft whine and stepped closer, his warm body pressing against her leg. She glanced down at him, tears blurring her vision. "What do you think?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How do you say goodbye to someone who is your whole world?" Sunny didn't answer, of course, but his gaze held hers, steady and unwavering. It was as though he was telling her she already knew the answer, that the strength she needed was within her. Her fingers tightened around the vial, the cool metal pressing into her palm. She took a deep breath, the salty air filling her lungs, and looked back out at the sea. Memories flooded her mind, James laughing as he twirled her in the kitchen, his voice warm and teasing the way he had looked at her during quiet moments, as though she were the only thing that mattered, the dreams they had shared, the plans they had made. She had clung to those memories for so long, afraid that letting them go would mean losing him all over again. But now she understood that they weren't chains, they were gifts. They were pieces of him she could carry forward, not as a weight, but as a light. With trembling hands, she unscrewed the cap of the vial. The ashes inside were so fine, so delicate they seemed almost weightless. She held the vial out over the edge, her heart pounding. "I love you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'll always love you." The wind caught the ashes, carrying them out over the ocean in a shimmering arc. Claire watched as they disappeared into the vastness, her tears falling freely now. Sunny pressed closer to her, his warm body grounding her as she let out a shaky breath. The ache in her chest didn't disappear, but it shifted, the sharp edges softening into something gentler. She had let go, but James wasn't gone. He was everywhere, in the wind, in the waves, in her heart. As the last traces of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Claire felt a quiet stillness settle over her. It wasn't peace, exactly, but it was the closest she had come in a long time. She knelt beside Sunny, wrapping her arms around him and burying her face in his fur. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice muffled. "For being here. For everything." Sunny licked her cheek, his tail wagging softly. His presence was a reminder that life went on, that there was still love and joy to be found even in the midst of loss. The walk back to the small cabin she had rented for the night was quiet. The only sounds the gentle rustle of the grass and the distant crash of the waves. Sunny stayed close to her side, his steps perfectly in sync with hers. The weight in her chest felt lighter, her breath coming easier with every step. That evening, Claire sat by the fireplace, the warmth of the flames chasing away the chill that had settled into her bones. Sunny lay at her feet, his head resting on her lap as she absently ran her fingers through his fur. She picked up her journal, the pages still open to the entry she had written earlier in the trip, and began to write again. The words came easily this time, flowing from her pen in a way that felt effortless. She wrote about the cliffs, about the ocean and the way it seemed to stretch on forever. She wrote about James, about the love they had shared and the life they had built together. But most importantly, she wrote about what she had learned, that letting go didn't mean forgetting, and that carrying someone with you didn't mean you couldn't move forward. When she finished, she set the journal aside and leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting closed. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel weighed down by grief. Instead, she felt something new: hope. It was a fragile thing, like the first green shoots of spring after a long winter, but it was there, growing quietly in the corners of her heart. Sunny stirred, lifting his head to look at her, his eyes bright and full of love. Claire smiled, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "You really are my sunshine," she said softly. "You remind me that there's still light, even when it feels like everything's dark." The next morning, Claire woke to the sound of birdsong and the soft glow of dawn filtering through the windows. She stretched, feeling a surprising lightness in her body, and glanced at Sunny, who was already waiting by the door, his tail wagging eagerly. All right, she said with a laugh, throwing on her jacket. "Let's see what the day has in store." They walked along the edge of the cliffs, the morning air crisp and filled with possibility. For the first time, Claire didn't feel like she was walking through life alone. Sunny was by her side, and James's presence lingered in the beauty of the world around her. She knew there would still be hard days, moments when the grief crept back in like a shadow. But now she also knew she was strong enough to face them. As they stood at the edge of the cliff once more, the sun rising over the ocean in a blaze of color, Claire turned to Sunny and smiled. "This is just the beginning," she said. And in her heart, she knew it was true. The first morning back home, Claire stood in the doorway of her kitchen, a cup of coffee warming her hands, and watched the golden sunlight spill across the backyard. The house felt different now, lighter, freer, as if the very air had shifted during her journey to Monarch Bluffs. The ghosts of her grief still lingered in the corners, but they no longer felt suffocating. Instead, they were part of her, a quiet presence that reminded her of the love she had shared with James and the strength she had found in letting go. Sunny bounded across the yard, chasing the long shadows cast by the trees. His golden fur gleamed in the sunlight, and his joyous energy seemed to pulse through the space, filling it with life. Claire smiled, the warmth of it spreading through her chest. She had spent so long feeling like her life was at a standstill, caught in the grip of pain and memory. But now, for the first time, she felt like she was moving forward, not running from the past, but walking alongside it. The morning was filled with simple rituals that felt new in their clarity. Claire tidied the house, her movements purposeful as she opened windows and let the cool breeze sweep through. She pulled the photo albums from the shelf in the living room, her fingers trailing over the leather binding as she hesitated. She hadn't touched them in months, the weight of what they held too much to bear. But now, with Sunny resting his head on her lap, his warm presence a silent encouragement, she opened the first page. The photos were a kaleidoscope of memories: James's crooked smile, the two of them hiking through forests, laughing over campfires, holding hands in the golden light of dusk. Each image brought a pang of sadness, but it was accompanied by something else: gratitude. These weren't just moments she had lost, they were moments she had lived, and they were hers to carry forward. Sunny nudged her hand, breaking her reverie. "You're right," Claire said softly, closing the album and setting it aside. "It's time to make some new memories." That afternoon, Claire found herself walking into the local animal shelter for the first time. The idea had come to her during the drive home, sparked by a conversation she'd had with a volunteer while on her road trip. Sunny had drawn people to them everywhere they went, his friendly nature and boundless energy breaking down barriers and opening doors. It had made her think about all the other animals out there waiting, hoping, needing someone to take a chance on them, just as she had taken a chance on Sunny. The shelter was bustling with activity, the sounds of barking dogs and cheerful voices filling the air. Claire felt a flicker of nervousness as she stepped inside, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of purpose. A young woman with a clipboard greeted her, her eyes lighting up as she noticed Sunny at Claire's side. "He's gorgeous," the woman said, crouching down to scratch behind Sunny's ears. "What can we do for you today?" Claire hesitated for only a moment before answering. "I'd like to volunteer," she said. "And I'd like Sunny to help." The woman's smile widened. "We'd love that. Dogs like Sunny are incredible for helping other animals adjust, especially the shy ones." Over the next few weeks, Claire and Sunny became fixtures at the shelter. Claire spent her mornings walking the dogs, cleaning kennels, and learning the quirks and personalities of each animal. Sunny, meanwhile, worked his magic, coaxing nervous dogs out of their shells and bringing smiles to the faces of staff and visitors alike. His boundless energy and calm demeanor seemed to soothe even the most anxious animals, and Claire couldn't help but marvel at how naturally he fit into this new role. One afternoon, as Claire sat in the play yard with a timid Labrador mix named Daisy, she felt a warm sense of fulfillment wash over her. Daisy had been skittish and withdrawn when she first arrived at the shelter, but after a week of gentle encouragement and Sunny's patient companionship, she was wagging her tail and nudging Claire's hand for more pets. Watching Daisy's transformation, Claire felt a surge of joy she hadn't experienced in years. "You're a natural," a voice said behind her. Claire turned to see one of the shelter's coordinators, a man named Ethan, standing by the fence. His dark eyes were warm and kind, and he held a leash in one hand, a playful border collie at his side. They had spoken a few times before, exchanging pleasantries while working with the dogs, but this was the first time she had noticed the quiet confidence in his demeanor. The way his smile seemed to carry genuine kindness. "I'm just following Sunny's lead," Claire said, gesturing to where Sunny was chasing a ball across the yard with a group of puppies. Ethan chuckled, stepping closer. "He's got a gift, that's for sure. And so do you." Claire felt a blush rise to her cheeks, but she smiled. "Thanks. It feels good to be doing something again, to feel useful." "You're more than useful," Ethan said, his voice soft. "You're making a difference." The sincerity in his words caught her off guard. and for a moment she didn't know what to say. But Ethan didn't push. He simply gave her a nod and a smile before leading the border collie back inside. As Claire watched him go, she felt something stir, a quiet curiosity, a flicker of possibility. It was small, but it was there, and she let herself hold on to it. Over time, Claire's life began to blossom in ways she hadn't imagined. She found herself reconnecting with old friends, joining them for coffee or walks in the park with Sunny by her side. Her mornings at the shelter became a source of joy and purpose, and her evenings were filled with quiet moments of reflection and creativity. She began sketching again, her drawings capturing the personalities of the shelter animals, the way their eyes lit up when they played, the hope they carried despite their circumstances. Through it all, Sunny remained her constant companion, his presence a steady reminder of how far she had come. On days when the memories of James felt heavier than usual, Sunny was there, his warm body pressed against her side, his gaze filled with quiet understanding. And on the days when laughter came easily, when the world felt bright and full of possibility, he was there too, his tail wagging in shared delight. One evening, as Claire sat on her porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The pain of losing James hadn't disappeared, it never would, but it no longer defined her. It was a part of her story, just as Sunny was, just as the new friendships she was forming were. It was a story of love, loss, and resilience, and it was hers to continue writing. As Sunny rested his head on her lap, his eyes closing in contentment, Claire smiled. She reached for her journal, her pen moving across the page with ease. Today I realized something. Love doesn't have an end, it transforms, it grows. It finds new ways to exist. Sunny taught me that. And I think I'm ready to see where it takes me next. And as the stars began to emerge in the twilight sky, Claire felt the quiet truth of those words settle deep within her heart. It was a new beginning, and she was ready for it.